So now we've seen how supply and demand zones are created and how we draw them on candlestick charts. However, as you've probably seen when you try to draw them yourself, supply and demand zones are literally going to be everywhere. If you draw on every single zone, your chart is going to be an absolute shit show, and you're going to see some zones play out and you're going to see a lot that don't really seem to work that well, which I understand, can be a little bit disheartening. But if you think about it, supply and demand zones are, literally everywhere in the market. They're supposed to be. And why are they everywhere? Well, if there are, if there weren't constantly imbalances between supply and demand, then price wouldn't never move, right? It would just be stuck in a range, or it would just be stood still because, well, the market must just deem that it is at a fixed and constant fair value. But in reality, what the market deems to be fair value, that is shifting every second of every day. So that balance between supply and demand is shifting constantly. Now, nearly every single zone, when price returns to it, not always, but it will generally form some degree of a reaction when price returns to that zone. So you will usually see price pause or maybe even just form a small bounce as those orders are exchanged between hands. And of course, in some circumstances, price will literally just smash straight through it and you won't see any reaction. But what we can do to filter out, those zones, or filter out a lot of them that are most likely not going to be worth the risk of trading, what can we do to try and filter out those poor quality zones? Because we don't just want to enter a position and risk our hard-earned capital just on any old zone that was created that doesn't have a lot of money behind it, that doesn't have that institutional backing. Because obviously that's not professional trading, right? That's just gambling. Well, there are certain confluences that we can look for to increase the probability of the zones having a large reaction or causing a large move. And one that we've looked at in depth so far is market structure. So we've now seen how we can use market structure to very effectively give us a bias on the direction of price, right? So structure tells us whether we are bullish or bearish. We know then whether we are trading that pro-trend run, or are we currently in that counter-trend pullback phase, right? And then, of course, when we start to look at multi-time frame analysis, really bringing in that new dimension to price to really help us nail down what the overall narrative is. So market structure is a very important tool that we can use in our analysis to really help us make sure that we are trading on the right side of the market. And that will increase the probability of the zones that we're looking to trade from, causing the type of large moves that we actually want to position ourselves in, right? Again, I know I sound like a broken record, but market structure will help us to manage our expectations of how far the move from that zone is likely to reach before price then may start to pull back or even reverse. Okay, so it gives us a massive edge with our trade management too. So again, that's why I personally believe that market structure is king. But then we looked at the concept of premium versus discount. Pretty simple one, right? It just helps us to see if we're looking to trade at a level that is well priced. So if we think about bringing supply and demand into this, we can look to buy from demand zones that are in those discount prices, and we can look to sell from those supply zones up in those premium prices to really kind of help, again, to increase our strike rate and to increase our overall reward to risk ratios. Now, there are some other very key concepts which we have not discussed or looked at yet, which we will look at in depth in future lessons, such as liquidity. So what you'll learn soon is we look to see, did the zone sweep liquidity and does the zone have inducement? Again, if you haven't got to those lessons, don't worry, you don't need to know what this is. We'll cover this in depth in the future. Another one is mitigations. So we want to see, is the zone unmitigated? And whenever I say that, I personally mean, is it a completely fresh zone? Okay, so nothing's tapped into it yet. Nothing has filled up any of the orders. It's completely fresh. It's completely unmitigated. And then the other aspect to that is that zone part of a demand or supply chain? So what you'll see is zones kind of tap into each other and they continue, and you kind of see this series of mitigations, which we call chains. Again, we'll get into this in more depth, but that can increase the probability of the zone you're looking from. And then finally, is the zone we are trading from, is it with or against the current order flow of the market? And again, we'll get into a bit more depth of that in future lessons. So don't worry about those gray ones too much for now. But what I want you to realize with this list that we've just gone through is all of those are great confluence that we should be using to make sure that we are trading with as high as a strike rate and as high as a risk to reward ratio as possible. But these confluences are what I call they're nice to haves. They're really nice to haves, but they're not necessarily a super strict requirement that you have to have it no matter what. Okay. So what I mean by that is that if you made some of these or all of these a strict requirement, then you would only ever buy from demand zones that were with a trend and that had to be in a discount because, in theory, those should be high probability, right? But then on the flip side, that also means that you would never sell from a supply zone in cheap discount prices that was also maybe against the trend, right? Because in theory, that should be, really low probability. So when you get later on in the course and we go in the trade plan module and we talk about all of this, it's going to be very dependent on each individual trader, on how you want to trade, what makes sense to you, how aggressive you want to be, what you have success with, what's easy in your psychology, etc., etc., etc. And that will come with time, experience, and testing. Okay, there's a million different ways in which you can use these concepts, right? But again, we'll get into that later. The main point I'm really just trying to make here is there's going to be a lot of things you're going to be learning that are going to help you to hopefully be trading from high probability supply and demand zones. Okay, but really, there are two core methods that we use to validate whether a supply and demand zone is one that we call an institutional zone. Okay, so this is kind of my way of just saying supply and demand zones are everywhere. We've learned how to draw them and identify them, but we don't want that many zones. We want to use a filter, right, where we can spot what we call institutional zones, those strong zones where we have a lot more conviction that big money stepped in when that zone was created. And like I said, that whole list of confluences help us do that. But there are two core ones that either one has to be present for it to be a valid zone. Otherwise, I don't even look to trade from it. I don't even draw it on, okay? So I personally view these two methods that we're about to look at in my plan as a minimum requirement. And I would advise you that you do this also. So what are these two methods? Well, because we want to find the zones where there was a drastic imbalance between supply and demand, so that when price does return to it, the probability of that big money stepping in again is a lot higher. And those are the areas that we want to trade from. So what can we do to try and validate which zones are going to be the strongest, the most significant, and therefore have the highest probability of causing a strong move? Well, the main idea, as you can see here, is to find a zone that achieved something significant in the market. Okay, so another simple way to think about this, if I've just said a lot of words that are going over your heads, which is fair enough. If you're looking at a supply and demand zone and you're going to draw it on, just ask yourself, what did this achieve? When this zone was formed and when price moved out of the zone, out of that range to create a zone, what did that movement go on to do? Okay, you want it to achieve something significant, and the more significant things it did, right? In theory, the stronger that zone should be. Okay, so hopefully this will make it a bit more simple. But the first and main way that we look at to validate that a zone is an institutional zone is we want to look for ones that led to a move that broke structure. Okay, so we want to find where did that demand come into the market that led to price being able to break structure to the upside to break a high and form a higher high. Likewise, we want to find where did that supply come into the market that led to price being able to break structure to the downside to break a low and form a lower low. Now, we know that there are three different types of structure: swing, internal, and fractal. So a boss, an IBOS, or a chock. The more significant a level of structure that a zone breaks, then the more significant that zone will likely be. Okay, so what that means is swing structure is obviously the most significant. Internal structure is less significant than swing structure, and obviously fractal structure is the weakest of the three. We want to look for the zones. So like if a zone breaks swing structure, that should be stronger than a zone that only broke a fractal high or low, right? Hopefully that makes sense. Okay, so all three of those zones can be tradable, but it's the swing zones, the ones that break swing structure, they're going to hold the most weight and have the highest probability of leading to that next large swing moves, right? And those are the swing runs that we want to catch and position ourselves in. So that's the first main way in which we can validate the significance of a supply and demand zone in the market. And that's by concentrating on ones which cause the break of structure. And to be honest with you, really that's it. This is pretty much the main way in which I will always validate a zone. Did it break any form of structure? As long as it at least broke a fractal high, then I'm interested in it. But ideally, the stronger the structure it breaks, the better the zone should be. Now, the second main way in which we use to validate institutional zones is doing something and achieving something very significant in the market is if a zone manages to overpower and take out another zone, causing that zone to fail. Okay, so we call these flips. So a supply to demand flip, where we have a supply zones that's in control, but then demand overpowers that supply zone and takes control. Okay, so supply flips the demand. So we call it a supply to demand flip, which is the example you can see on the screen. And the opposite of that would be where demand flips to supply. Okay, and don't worry, we'll go into this in loads more depth in the future lessons. But when you find a zone that combines both methods, so not only does it cause a break of structure, but it also causes another strong zone to fail in the process. So you get a structure break and a flip. That is when you have a high probability zone. Again, when you compare those two reasons with all of the other confluence we're going to use, market structure, liquidity, blah, 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 okay? So for price to either break structure or take out another zone, generally we can assume that it's taken institutional backing. So, big money has had to step into the market there in order to cause the zone to flip and to cause the structure to break, right? So they're the two methods, the main methods that we use to filter out all of those supply and demand zones on your charts to try and find the footprints of where big money has stepped into the market. So it's our job to spot those and then try to capitalize on future moves from those zones, or we will sometimes call these zones points of interest, POIs, okay? It's an area in what we're interested in, okay? So yeah, over the next two lessons, we're going to look at each of these two methods in depth.